to calling for the repeal of FEMPI, and the reason for that is because we have been told from day one that FEMPI was brought in 2009 that we were in a state of emergency, so the government needed to bring in emergency legislation in order to reduce public sector workers' pay. I was just looking up who made the famous quote, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," and it's attributed to a few people, including Churchill and Rahm Emanuel, who both said that you can do things in a crisis that you normally wouldn't get away with. Now, certainly one can argue we were in a crisis in 2009, but your party have, since the election, been declaring that we're in recovery. We know that the recovery has been felt by some, but certainly not by the vast majority of people, and certainly not by workers. So the repeal of FEMPI for us would be the beginning of what we think is payback time for workers. If we're in recovery, Taoiseach, why do we need emergency legislation, and why will we continue to penalise public sector workers if that indeed is the case before the 30th of June? Because the penalties on public sector workers are absolutely massive. It means that many of them cannot even afford, in an accommodation crisis, cannot even afford to put a roof over their heads in a decent manner. And there would be a big payback to the economy if public sectors were to have their pay restored, because then they could spend it in the local economy and begin to generate some activity. So it's really important that we know if and when the government intend extending this emergency repressive legislation, and if this government continue to make one of its hallmarks emergency legislation while we claim that the economy is in recovery. It certainly doesn't bode well for building confidence in the economy if on the one hand we say it's in recovery, and on the other here's punitive emergency legislation to deal with the public sector.
Thank Deputy Smith for her comments. The programme for government is very clear. It says we will establish a public service pay commission to examine pay levels across the public service, including entry levels of pay. We will support the gradual negotiated repeal of the financial emergency measures in the Public Interest Acts, having due regard to the priority to improve public services and in recognition of the essential role played by public servants. As Deputy will be aware, this is already underway, and it's an orderly negotiated repeal of the FEMPI legislation. I'd remind you that because of careful and prudent management of the economy, not without difficulty, the unemployment figures yesterday were 7.8%, down from just over 15 5 years ago, which is a very significant improvement indeed. We need to do more, and obviously as resources come into the economy, you can then spend these and divert them to areas of disadvantage and social need. We dealt with this before Christmas in terms of the FEMPI legislation, and we're now in the process of orderly unwinding of the Financial Emergency Provisions Act.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Our next question is from Deputy Catherine.